Know how to do that.
All right, we are recording, and Paul, you are free to take it away.
Thank you, Colin, as always, for your expertise. Good evening, Central Theologians. How is everyone doing? Hopefully well.
Yes.
Last Tuesday, we discussed the idea of God, and that is obviously shared by all three of the Abrahamic religions. However, Christianity added the doctrine of the Trinity. So our question is, why? Tonight, we explore the answer to that question by focusing on Jesus professed as the Christ. So both Judaism and Islam affirm Jesus as a prophet, and a very important one. But they do not understand Jesus to be the Christ, the Messiah, the Savior. As I mentioned last Tuesday, the inscription on the inside of the Dome of the Rock says, Allah has no son. So Christianity is the outlier of the Abrahamic religions. Christianity is the exception. So why does Jesus become the second person of the Trinity for Christians? That's our question. And for our introduction, I want to make three very brief comments. First, we need to acknowledge the context of the early Jesus movement. I will highlight the conversations and controversies that shaped both the language and the beliefs, the creeds of the early church. Consequently, I will mention the boundary markers or extreme positions that the church wants to avoid. Think of a highway with a center line down the middle and ditches on both sides of the road that you obviously want to stay out. Heresies are half-truths that function like the shoulder of the road or the rumble strips that alert and warn us that we are drifting, that we're departing the main road and heading into the ditch. Theologically, then, we're heading into inappropriate or invalid or illegitimate theological language and ideas that the church wants to promote. Second, two dominant questions will guide us. Why did the early church elevate its thoughts about and claims for Jesus to the status of truly divine? And second, what is the theological problem to which God in Jesus is the solution? So the doctrine of Christology, which we'll be discussing tonight, addresses these questions and more. Third, before we begin, one brief comment on the order or sequence of tonight's conversation. Theologically, we start with creation, then move to the fall and sin. That's the problem, and conclude with Christology, which talks about the person or the nature of Christ, as well as the work of Christ, and that is the solution. Historically, the order was the opposite, or the reverse. Jesus died on the cross and was resurrected, and retrospectively, the early church mapped or imposed Jesus onto the Jewish narrative. That is, the tradition read backwards or reinterpreted the meaning of creation and the fall through the lens of Jesus as the Christ. Then it reread Jewish history forward to the present. And this is usually talked about in terms of prophecy and fulfillment. And we can talk about that in more detail if you like. So if you'll turn to your outline, I begin with John Milton's Paradise Lost, and I just want to briefly read the first few lines. Of man's first disobedience and the fruit of that forbidden tree, whose mortal taste brought death into the world and all our woe, with loss of Eden, till one greater man restore us and regain the blissful seat. It's obvious that Milton is following the theological trajectory at this point. He's talking about the necessity of human salvation. That is, why do we need reconciliation or redemption? And then he obviously references the person, Jesus, who accomplishes this feat, or what we'll call atonement. So we'll start then with looking at creation and the fall and sin as a preface, a necessary, essential theological preference before we talk about Jesus. So I want to highlight just features of the creation. I won't go through the entire outline. As you noted, it's a tad lengthy. That's because the Jesus tradition is the crux, if you will, the core of the Christian message. Hence, they call us Christians or Christianity. So we have to focus on this. And the creeds, if you look at the creeds, particularly Apostles' Nicene Creed, they have a statement about God. They have a little almost footnote to Holy Spirit. The core, the middle, the large chunk, that is the meat of the creed, has to do with Christ. How do you negotiate the concept of monotheism and at the same time want to affirm the accomplishment, the reconciliation and redemption of Jesus, which moves him closer to being divine? And so you have these issues in here. Okay, so creation, 5 quick points. Creation ex nihilo, that's just a fancy Latin word for out of nothing. Now, why is that important? Because God does not share the stage. God is wholly independent. God is transcendent. And that is, God is qualitatively different as creator and we as creatures. So this talks about then creation in relational terms. And of course, that's the key. I'm not talking in temporal terms. I'm not talking about chronology, whether or not it's historically true. That's not the theological question. The question is, what does it mean to say that Jesus creates? And he creates out of nothing, therefore God creates, and he creates out of nothing. And why is that important? It's because God now is the sole actor. So God is qualitatively different than we are. So the world and human beings are absolutely dependent upon God. That's the key. 2, creation is good. And that's also rejecting dualism, that is, 2 gods, as well as rejecting the concept of the world as inherently evil. Neither of those are permissible. God cannot be complicit in what we understand evil or suffering to be. Yet we acknowledge, as Bart says, there is a shadow side to creation. And of course, we're going to have to get to that in more detail in just a moment. 3, creation has a goal or a purpose, and that human beings are in some sense empowered to be co-creators, partners with God. In terms of Judaism, the term is tikkun olam, Tikkun Olam, tikkun olam. That is, what is the vocation of a Jew? It is to heal or repair the world. And of course, Christians are doing the same thing. What are Christians saying? Christians, the vocation is to what? Build, construct the kingdom of God on earth as it is in heaven. Same concepts. And the other purpose is for human beings to be in relationship to God. And Augustine's quote from his book on the Confessions is the exemplary way of talking about it. He says, "You have made us," you being God, "have made us toward yourself, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you." That's the relational dimension of creation and the purpose of creation, so that God can have genuine relationship with other. 4th, we mentioned obviously last Tuesday that creation involves an act of separation. That is, act of separation in terms of God creates, the immanent Trinity, God as triune, creates the other in terms of world, and that's the economic Trinity. And last of all, human beings are made in the image of God, imago Dei. That's the crowning jewel of creation. That's the last act of creation. And human beings are made in the image of God. In this sense, we mean a triune image. That is, human beings in some sense mirror the essence or the nature of God, not in terms of perfection, but in terms of ontological structure. We too are made for each other and for God. This understanding as imago Trinitatis, that is, human beings made in the image of God, that is triune in nature and needing others, the intersubjectivity that we talked about. The beauty of that, of course, is codified both by Torah and by Jesus's two great commandments. Love the Lord your God, and you love your neighbor as yourself. And all this theologically is wrapped up in the concept of imago Dei. That is, human beings are created for life in communion, both with God and with other human beings. And that's the beauty of Trinitarian understanding. Okay, so we've moved to page 2. We will now undertake an understanding of how can creation be good? How can God, who is both all-loving and all-powerful, create a world which in some sense falls, or in some sense fails to live up to its mission or its intention? How in the world do you get evil and suffering in a world if a loving and all-powerful God creates the world? That's the Christian conundrum. Indeed, one can argue that's the central conundrum, problem, dilemma for all Abrahamic religions. This is not unique to Christianity. The unique part will come later. So again, we're speaking theologically. What does it mean to be a human being? It means that we are finite freedom or self-transcending finitude. And those are the two different ways that we can talk about it. And why is it important to talk about finite and freedom? Because finite acknowledges our limits. Freedom nominally, in some sense, connotes our possibility, our potential, so that we can become actual. Self-transcending, again, that acknowledges the capacity of humans to be more. That is, we can get outside of ourselves. We can talk about the past and the future. We can ask questions to which we don't have adequate solutions or responses, but we are finite. And this is the tension. So human beings reside theologically at the intersection of horizontal world, that is the historical plane on which you and I live, but also the vertical or the transcendent plane. That is, we can envision, we can ask, we can anticipate, we can expect. We do things that we assume other creatures cannot do. So we can ask questions about the nature of God. Those are things that we assume creatures are not capable of performing. So human beings then live at this intersection, if you will, between both finitude and freedom, the capacity to anticipate and understand more. And it's that consciousness of our limits that both teases us into seeking more and activates then what we will call sin or the fall. And this is described obviously by the serpent. That is, the serpent says, "You shall be like God." And there's the ideal, I guess, ideal may not be the right word, but there's the direct implication of the more. You shall be like God. So the tradition, again, is negotiating extremes. It wants to avoid certain claims. It needs to avoid the assertion that the world is tragic, that in some sense, God is indicted. God is complicit in creating a world that is flawed from the beginning. But at the same time, the tradition has to avoid the other extreme of dualism. That is, the way to talk about the possibility of sin, evil in the world is to talk about two gods. So you have a good God on the one hand, and you have, quote, a bad God, good God, evil God. Zoroastrianism is the best example of that. And so you solve the problem of theodicy, of the question of how do you get suffering, and particularly of innocent people, into the world. And so the Adamic myth, that is the first three chapters, first chapters 1 and 2 are about creation, and chapter 3 is obviously having to do with what Christians call the fall. So we now move to theological anthropology, and don't get too nervous about that concept. Again, anthropology having to do with people, anthropos, But we're not talking about anthropology in the cultural sense of digging artifacts and doing archaeology. We are doing archaeology in the sense that we're looking at the interior structure of what it means to be human. So theological anthropology is looking at how human beings are structured in such a way that they are finite, but they have freedom, that they're self-transcending, but they at the same time are finite creatures. So this is, I'll move through this quickly because it can get technical, and I tried in the outline to be as clear as I could be, and I don't want us to get hung up on it, but the point we have to realize is that the tradition has to account for what it means to be a human being. The tradition has to, in some sense, mirror the experience that you and I have. So we have to be able to define a problem such that Jesus is the solution to the problem, but we have to make sure that the problem is relevant, that it's not contrived. And so what does it mean to be a human being? It means to have two qualities. And notice that one is internal and one is external. Anxiety, that is the disproportion, the claim of finite freedom is that I know I can do more. I know I can want more. I know I can achieve more. And so this more and more. This is what creates anxiety inside of ourselves. But at the same time, there is an external dimension, meaning by that, the serpent. The serpent is the symbol of that which resides in the exterior structure of the world, that's in the universe, that is the temptation, right? That teases us. Yes, you can be like God. So living in internal anxiety and at the same time living with different stimuli in the world, some for good and some for not. The fall then, chapter 3 of Genesis, is the paradigmatic event. Now this is very important. Paradigmatic is just a fancy adjectival form of paradigm. It becomes the model, if you will. It becomes the scheme by which Christians understand what it means to be human. This is obviously not part of the Jewish tradition. Yes, the story is in the Hebrew Bible, Jewish scriptures. Christians, though, are going to read it differently. That's okay. This is a description, not a judgment. So Jews are not going to see this as a paradigmatic event because the problem is not sin. That's the way Christians are going to define the human condition. The problem is sin. The problem for Jews is exile. So the question is, how do you return from exile? That's the problem that the Jews, that's how they understand the biblical narrative. And we can talk about that if you have more questions. And so what we see in the fall then is this distortion of truth of the human condition, the tease of the serpent, and the questions that Adam and Eve have. So the prohibition is the way that it starts, right? You shall not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. What's the very first thing you do when you see a wet paint sign? On a bench, on a door, on a wall. You are tempted to do what? Reach out and touch, right? Is it really wet? Okay. That is an example of the distortion. Except here, we're reaching out and touching a lot more, i.e. the tree. Okay. So this raises the desires, which triggers and activates the possibility of sin. That is, the balance that we have inside of ourselves is no longer in order. So there's an imbalance. The scales are tipping one side or the other. We'll go to that. So the concept of original sin, which we could talk about for a long time, essentially formulated by Augustine at the end of the 4th century. I personally don't like, I shouldn't be saying this, I mean, who am I to question Augustine, but I personally don't like the concept of original sin. I understand what he's trying to do. That is, he's trying to read the story in such a way that he can identify how you get sin in the world and then how that is transmitted from generation to generation. That's his intention. And he literalizes the story in order to do that, hence its original sin. I would prefer the concept of universal sin. That is, instead of reading the story on an historical level, I want to read it on a theological level. That is, the story indicates that all of us are entrapped in sin. So human beings then move from the garden and are expelled from the garden. Human beings then move from what we call essential to existential existence. Paul Tillich, I think, has a fabulous phrase that is, in the garden, in this idyllic world, we are in what he calls the state of dreaming innocence. like a small child, dreaming innocence, not aware of good and evil. But this dreaming innocence is not full consciousness. And therefore, there's no way to have what you and I would call an adult relationship. So obviously, if we're going to have relationships with God and with others, we need to be able to have volition and will in a way that infants do not. And so dreaming innocence is the way that Tillich talks about it. And then the fall is the way in which we move into full consciousness, which has both perils and promise, right? It's good and bad, reward and punishment. Now, Niebuhr's comment, sin is inevitable but not necessary, is, I think, the best encapsulation of the Christian understanding. That is, everyone, universal, everyone has sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. But it's not necessary, meaning by that, it's not built into the structure. Because if it's built into the structure, then we would have to, in some sense, indict God as a co-conspirator of evil. And the tradition obviously doesn't want to do that. Again, we can talk about that. So the interior structure of sin is simply the way in which the tradition wants to talk about the internal way in which the disruption or the denial of our relatedness, which is what sin is. And this imposes, kind of like quicksand, freedom then entraps itself, it enslaves itself. And once you're in quicksand, the more thrashing about, the worse it gets. And you can get in on your own, but you cannot extricate or liberate yourself. And that's an analogy. So there are two types of sin. And the reason there are two types of sin is because, again, human beings live where? We reside at the intersection of the vertical, the transcendent, and the horizontal or the historical. So idolatry, which is pride, idolatry is the elevation of the self. You will be like God. So it refuses to acknowledge the fact that we are finite, and it wants to assume that we have this, what should we say, unfettered potential. So the vertical is in some sense enlarged, and that's the problem of idolatry. You have elevated a finite object to the level of the infinite. And flight is just the opposite. It talks about the horizontal level. It's the refusal to exercise our freedom. Remember, human beings are finite, free, right? Self-transcending finitude. So if you overemphasize one side, if you overemphasize the freedom or the self-transcending side, you get idolatry. If you overemphasize the finite side and you refuse to activate your freedom, i.e., you don't take responsibility for yourself, that's called flight. Freud, psychologists know this, right? So that's the sin of finitude. That's the horizontal. Now, what are the consequences of these two sins? And this is where I think I find this absolutely stunning. Obviously, guilt is the inward consequence. Guilt is the awareness of our responsibility. And so if we do not have a moral compass, if we do not have moral consciousness, we say there's a defect in you. That is, there's some kind of personality disorder. So guilt, the feeling of guilt is a positive feeling in that it acknowledges that we know the difference between right and wrong. Now, in the world in which we live, there are various structures or expressions or manifestations of this internal nature, and they're law, death, and worldly powers. The law then is an objectification of guilt. The reason we have to have laws is because we know we are not going to be consistent and ideal in our behavior and our attitudes towards others. And so we have to create boundaries. Death is the same way. There are different forms of death, obviously. Freud talks about a death wish, and that's the objectification of flight. That is, we refuse to accept responsibility. And the worldly powers are the objectification of idolatry, and that would, anything racism, sexism, any of those isms. That is, you're denying the freedom of the other, and you're elevating yourself over someone else. That's a form of idolatry. Notice then that salvation, by definition, has to transform and redeem both the internal and the external structures. Why? Self and others. Relationships. We have to deal with ourselves. We have to deal with others. And this is, of course, a problem in the Christian church for many of us, is that we talk about piety or pious or, am I saved? That's the definition of self, but we don't look at the structure. We don't look at the overarching environment within which you and I live. So there's both an external structure, symbol is the serpent, and there's the internal. That is what's going on in terms of the self and anxiety. Okay, I'll stop there for just a moment. Any questions? Everything is perfectly clear.
Just a reminder, you are free to unmute yourself to ask a question, or you are free to use the chat function. It will be read off for you.
You're free to use it. I hope I can use it, Colin. Question. Jim, did you have one?
I do.
Yes, sir.
When we think about the universe today, and I
Yes.
don't think they knew about that.
Of course not. They're pre-science.
I'm still trying to figure out why God needs this relationship. What's that for? I don't understand that.
Well, it's built into the concept of a triune God. Because we're talking triune means you have a self and you have other, and then you have that agency or the energy of that relationship. So if God is love, God loves the other. And so God, in this sense, is self-contained. That is, God as triune is self-contained. But that's simply a conscious, again, this is a projection. This is the way humans think about God, by taking the concept of the economic trinity and then transposing it back onto God's nature, right? That is the interior life of God. So this is theological conjecture, which we try to make sense of. So if God is love, and if God loves the other, then the way that one would optimize, if I may use that term for God, would be to create an other outside of the self, external to the self, which then creates a different level of love and relationship than simply it being internal. Does that make sense in any way?
It does, but I'm just...
God creates out of love, in other words. God creates out of both the love and also the desire for genuine fellowship, communion, relationship.
Thank you.
That's the quick theological answer.
Yeah.
Anything else before we move on? So what I want us to make sure we understand is that Christians simply can't talk about Jesus as if Jesus and Christianity live in a vacuum, or in some sense, they are simply just doing some kind of theoretical exercise. The point is that we have to understand the way in which both the world and human beings are structured, such that it creates both the possibility of glory, love, all the positives, but it also creates a possibility for a very messy, murky world that has evil and suffering. So again, Christianity, like any religious tradition, has to acknowledge what you and I would call the realities of life. How do we embrace them and redeem them concurrently? That's what we have to do. So remember, Christian theology is looking at the totality of what it means to be a human being in the world. And now we're looking at various, elements, various dimensions of that. So we looked at God, now we're looking at Christ. And obviously for Christians, Christ is the big one. So if you turn to page 3 of the outline, we'll look at Christology. That's just a fancy word. Christos, meaning Christ. This is Greek, and logos, meaning word. So it's the word about Christ, the words about Christ, the study of Christ. And that's usually framed in 2 ways. That is, Jesus is obviously the core of the Christian tradition. It's the central claim or profession, belief. And that's traditionally divided into 2 subsets. The first being, who is Jesus? What does it mean to say Jesus is the Christ? That is, what's the person of Jesus? And we'll look at that first. And then we have to talk about, what does Jesus do? What does he accomplish? What does it mean to say Jesus saves? And that's the work of Christ. And we'll look at that as well. So we're going to have 4 moves. We're going to be looking at the person. We're going to be looking at the work. We're going to look at crucifixion and resurrection. And we're going to do this in less than an hour. You guys are awesome. You know, I'm foolish enough to talk about it. You're at least smart enough to figure it out. I mean, so we're talking about massive content here, right? We're talking about the core of the tradition. So my goal is to frame the conversation. We're not going to be able to answer all the questions. And I will choose where I want to spend more of my time in terms of what we want to emphasize. So on page 3, I've created, like I always do, what are the problems that contemporary Christians face living in the 21st century? And I've identified 6 problems. There are a lot more, obviously. The first one has to do with the person of Christ, and you can read that on your own. And the second has to do with the work. We're obviously going to be talking about both of those. The third has to do with historical consciousness. We'll talk about this more in the last session. That is, we recognize that you and I live in history, and because of that, there are going to be some concerns that are going to be, what should we say, idiosyncratic to us in a post-Enlightenment world, and also quite vexing at the same time. The fourth had to do with the tradition, and the fifth one is what I want to spend just a moment on, just to highlight, and that has to do with questions about Jesus in Scripture, particularly the variety of image. Traditionally, we talk about 4 different images of Jesus. That is, each gospel portrays its understanding of who is Jesus. So you talk about Mark's Jesus, Matthew, Luke, and John. I want to expand that in honor of Dr. Sumney, and we talk about Paul, but I also want to acknowledge Revelation. So very quickly, Paul focuses on cross and resurrection. That's really all you have to know. Jesus crucified and risen. That's pretty much what Paul talks about. He's never met the historical Jesus. He doesn't have stories about Jesus. He's only got 2 little stories, and one of them obviously is Lord's Supper. So Paul is not worried about the person as much as he is who is Jesus in relationship to crucifixion and resurrection. Matthew's Jesus is essentially the new Moses. Mark's Jesus is highly apocalyptic, Son of Man, Son of God, who suffers and dies and is vindicated by God. Luke's Jesus essentially is a rejected social prophet, and John's Jesus is all over the place, but obviously he's the Word, he's the Lamb of God. And then Revelation, we very, very seldom talk about Revelation in terms of its portrait of Jesus, because quite frankly, it's not very nice. And that's a whole nother course, let alone conversation, because the revelation of Jesus rides a war horse and he kills people, right? So very, very different. So what is going on there? So we have to acknowledge that there are a variety of images or portraits, understanding, sketches of Jesus in the New Testament. And if you go to number 6, we don't talk about this very much. That is, there are actually 34 Gospels or portraits of Jesus. The 4, quote, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but there are also 30 others. These are called the non-canonical Gospels. We have them either by the full, like the Gospel of Thomas, we have the full text, we have fragments or portions of a text, or we have a reference to them, like in a letter or something, they refer to one of the other Gospels. So there are 30 other, outside of the 4 canonical Gospels, there are 30 other Gospels that we're aware of. And so we need to be aware of this rich tradition. Why am I saying this to you? Because I want you to be aware that there is an enormous conversation going on in the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd centuries before this kind of starts reaching consensus. And the first consensus is going to be Nicaea, which we have to talk about in 325. So for 3 centuries, the church is churning. It's like an agitation cycle in the washer, trying to figure out who is Jesus. And there are a bunch of responses. Who decides and how do we decide which ones are going to be acceptable and those that are not? Well, at the beginning, all of them are acceptable because these Gospels are being written to Christian communities by Christians. I shouldn't say Christians early. I should be saying Jesus followers, right? So you need to be aware that there's a larger conversation going on. And I find it fascinating, but we won't spend a lot of time on that tonight. Okay, so let's look at page 4. We need to identify the 4 major titles that we use in church today about Jesus. Well, the first one is pretty obvious. That is, we call Jesus the Christ, Christians. That's the Greek term for Messiah, which is in Hebrew. Okay, the Hebrew Bible, the Jewish scriptures are written in Hebrew. The Christian texts, the Gospels and the other texts, of the 27 books of the New Testament, are written in Koine Greek. So 2 different languages, and obviously anybody that's done any work with languages knows that there's always some issues when you do translations, etc. So the Jewish context for the term Messiah simply means anointed one, someone that has oil placed on them for usually a priestly role. And so the expectation for the coming of the Messiah is heightened and more pronounced after the destruction of the northern kingdom in 722. And there one strand, it's not the only strand, but one strand has to do with this expectation of a kingly figure out of the Davidic line or the house of David. And obviously that's what the Gospels are going to be talking about, right? The Christian context comes, the question that I like is the one that Jesus asked at Caesarea Philippi in chapter 8 of Mark. Who do you say that I am? And so we begin to see the development of these various images. The second image, Lord, actually, it's used in the Hellenistic world. It's used by the Romans, but it's also part of the Jewish tradition. Remember, the followers of Jesus, like Jesus, are Jews. They're not, I don't think we should use the term Christian. That's premature. The tradition is going to move in a way by 150, the middle of the 2nd century, we can talk about an intentional self-consciousness that is separate from Judaism. But around the year 500 BCE, we begin to see Judaism reluctant, hesitant to use the word God. And they use what we would call a substitute word, Adonai, A-D-O-N-A-I. Adonai then usually is translated in our English as Lord. So we begin to see the substitute word. Remember, I say Christians will write the word G-O-D. Jews will write G-D, right? And so they will not pronounce, they will not say the word God. They will use the substitute word Adonai. And Adonai is translated to Lord. So we begin to see the confluence both of the Jewish tradition and this early Jesus movement in using the term Adonai. Son of Man is, for me, very complex. It too comes out of the Jewish tradition. It is a reference, it can be used as kind of a substitute or an additional way to talk about oneself. So it's self-referential, kind of like a pronoun is. And it can also be used as a substitute for man. Mankind is how the text used. I prefer to think of it in terms of human. And sometimes you'll see it translated in a neutral way, mortal, oh mortal, as opposed to oh man or son of man. And sometimes it can be used as it is in Daniel as a term ancient one. And so we begin to see then 3 uses, and Walter Wink, W-I-N-K, I think is the most influential scholar on this topic. So 3 uses in the New Testament. One is obviously used like a pronoun or a substitute. I have an example of that. The association of Son of Man and suffering. We see that particularly in the Gospel of Mark. And then you also have a third kind of a heavenly figure, or what we would call an apocalyptic figure, also in Mark and other Gospels. And that also comes out of the book of Daniel. So Son of Man, we should not flatten that out. We should not assume that there's a single reference. It's multivalent, it's dynamic, it's used in different contexts and can mean different things. And that's the term that Jesus uses the most for himself. Now, Son of God is the one that most Christians prefer. And for me, it's the most problematic because, again, we have to understand it in terms of its context. Usually it's used in some sense a way of having divine qualities. But let's look down at the last three. And this is not hard, fast rule, but I don't know of many scholars that will argue that Jesus has what you and I call messianic self-consciousness. That is, does Jesus really understand himself to be the Christ, the Son of God, the language, the titles that we use? Most scholars will say no. That language is attributed to him by others. And I've listed a lot of these passages. And there are scholars that disagree with one another. So I'm not talking as if there is an absolute consensus on this. That's not the case. But most of the time, the references of Son of God are not by Jesus himself, but they are people using that term, applying it, ascribing it, attributing it to him. So the Son of God language for me talks about the unity more than it talks about an identity. And then the last point I think is the most critical. In Judaism, Son of God is used, but it assumes that the referent, the person to whom you're referring and applying the term Son of God, is human. In the Hellenistic Roman world, Son of God applies to only one person, Caesar. You and I, in our culture, in our time, assume that if I say Son of Man, I'm talking about the human quality of Jesus. And if I'm talking about Son of God, I'm talking about the divine qualities. So in the way the tradition, of course, the tradition doesn't make this determination until the 4th century. And these terms are obviously applied to Jesus in the 1st century. So again, we're reading backwards, right? We're imposing our Christian understanding onto the text, which is what we all do. We'll talk about that obviously a little bit in the last session as well. So the tendency to think Son of Man was the way the tradition talked about the humanity of Jesus, and Son of God was the way the tradition talked about the divinity of Jesus, is both limited in terms of the context, and it's just too superficial. It does not acknowledge the complexity and the tensiveness of the culture at the time. So to claim that Jesus is Son of God for a Jew is okay because it doesn't imply divineness. But if I'm a Roman and I use that term, then there are complications because there's only one divine person, and that's Caesar. So if one applies the title Son of God to Jesus, in essence, you're saying Caesar is not Son of God, divine. And that is a political statement, which obviously is fraught with peril. Okay, I'll stop for a second. Any questions or comments on what I've said? And do not assume that my interpretation of the tradition or a particular title or a way of talking about a particular concept is the only one. I am one voice among many voices. The tradition by definition is communal, right? So there are disagreements inside the tradition, then and now. And Jim, you want to have a disagreement inside the tradition?
Now, I just want to clarify something. You were talking
Sure.
about those 30 other gospels or whatever you call it.
Yeah, the non-canonical, those
Yeah.
are not, those that didn't make the cut into the New Testament.
Now, how old are those things?
Some are, that's a great question. Most of them are later. The key gospel, some people call the 5th gospel, is the Gospel of Thomas. And if you like the Gospel of Thomas in the sense that you think there, and there's a lot of parallels, virtually many of the sayings in the Gospel of Thomas, I can't do the percentage off the top of my head. Every canonical gospel has similar ones. They're sayings. The Gospel of Thomas is a saying source. It doesn't tell stories. It just lists Jesus said, Jesus said, Jesus said. And so many of the ones in the Gospel of Thomas are included in the 4 canonical. So many people will argue that it's an early gospel, i.e. contemporary, say, 50s, 60s, somewhere in there. Whereas people that don't want to mess with it, it has problems. as well. They'll argue that it's second century, early second century, 110, 120, 125, somewhere in that range. So it's later than. Majority of the non-canonical Gospels, which we know of, are later, second century. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does, but they don't add anything to the discussion.
Oh, yes, they add a lot to this discussion. And that's where I could spend a lot of time because I really like them. What do they add to the discussion? Let me just do very briefly because I can't do justice to that question. They add at least two things. One, they acknowledge the remarkable diversity of the early Jesus movement. And they also acknowledge the sincere, genuine effort of Jesus followers to try to understand who is this person. And it's a very difficult concept to wrap your head around then and now. And so the tradition, it has this inordinate number of portraits and sketches. And the reason they're doing that is because it makes sense for them where they are in whatever context they are with whatever issues they're dealing with. And you can see that even in the canonical Gospels. The contrast between the Gospel portraits. Mark is a very dark, and Pastor Davis preached on this a number of times about the buffoonery, if you will, of the disciples in Mark. They don't get it at all. And Mark's Gospel is, some people say it's it's essentially a passion narrative. It's dark and dreary. It's very apocalyptic. The world is not good. Very different than John's Gospel, which is, the favorite gospel according to all the Gallup polls. And it talks about the ethereal, the word became flesh, pre-existent, the glorification of Jesus. Very, very different. And I could go on, but that's it. It acknowledges the fact that tradition, the early Jesus movement, is much bigger than what the New Testament captures. And so it adds to us the variety, and it also, the more text you have in theory, the greater possibility to reconstruct a life of Jesus. And let me just say one other thing, Jim. And this moves us in a direction I don't want to go, but I want to acknowledge this. When I think about Jesus, there are actually three levels of Jesus. There is the person Jesus of Nazareth, who lived at the beginning of what we call the first century of the Common Era. Okay? And that person is pretty much is remote from us. We don't have, he was a peasant. We don't have anything from Jesus. He didn't write anything. So number two, the second level is what we call the reconstructed Jesus, the historical Jesus, the Jesus that the scholars are trying to piece together as best they can. And then the third Jesus is what we call the church's Jesus, or the creedal Jesus, or the pious Jesus, the Jesus that we see embedded in the creeds that we're going to get to tonight. And it's not a question of one having priority over the other. Please, again, I'm being descriptive, not judgmental. But we have to acknowledge that the Jesus that we worship is not the Jesus who lived at that time in that place. There is no way that we can, in some sense, fully retrieve the understanding of Jesus, a person. And so when we talk about the Gospels, we talk about Mark's Jesus. We talk about Matthew's Jesus or Paul's Jesus. And the reason we do that is because each one is trying to understand, what does it mean to say that Jesus is the Christ? In the same way that if we go into Lexington and we divide up into a group and we assume that we're going to visit 4 churches and each preacher is going to preach on the same text, do you think we're going to hear 4 identical sermons? Probably not. So it's not to say that one sermon is right and the other 3 are wrong. That's simply not a fair way to characterize what I'm trying to get across. Jesus is bigger, more mysterious, more elusive than you and I have the capacity to comprehend. And so historically is one level, but theologically there's another level. And we're talking primarily on the theological level, so I haven't gone into the historical part. They're both valid. They require each other. They require each other. if you have theology without a person, then you just got fantasy running around. Okay, and I see very quickly, Hank, I think you've got a question. Is that right? Could you speak a little what it means to exist in a high Christology or low? Oh, that's very good. Thank you for that, Hank, and thank you for joining us. When we talk about high and low Christologies, what we're really talking about, and we'll get to this a little bit more, Hank, with the creeds. A low Christology essentially implies that the starting point of your thinking or the assumption is that Jesus is human. Now, how do we get this human to be divine? High Christology starts with the opposite. And the Gospel of John in the prologue, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. I believe that's our window in the church, right? That's a high Christology, meaning that you're starting with Jesus as, as kind of co-equal with God, the Word. And now you have to figure out, how does a divine being look like us, become human? So low Christology assumes that we're starting kind of with the human side, and we try to figure out how you can get the divine in there. High Christology assumes just the opposite, of the reverse. You start with the assumption that Jesus is divine. Now we have to figure out how we get Jesus to be human. So that will be a good way to segue into this, Hank. So thank you very much for your question. On page 5, if you'll join me, we're looking now at the person of Christ, and there are two major questions we have to address. And this, when I say we have to address, I'm talking about the tradition. So this is Hank's question. So great lead in, unrehearsed. Thank you. The first issue is, how do we relate then the pre-existent John's gospel, how we get the pre-existent and exalted Christ? How in the world does that understanding of Jesus relate to God? Okay, so the divine in Christ, the divine in God. And what do we have to avoid? We have to avoid, obviously, that there are two co-equal gods. That's the ditch that we can't go into. You can't say two gods. Remember, this is monotheism, right? And at the same time, the tradition has to acknowledge that Jesus and God are not identical. Jesus prays to God in the Garden of Gethsemane. Okay, that's kind of a weird concept if they're identical. So there has to be unity of their divinity, right? Unity, there has to be some coalescence there. And there also has to be difference or distinction. And this is the conundrum that Christians have. The claim that Jesus is the Christ means that we now have to think in terms of both the contours of the tradition of monotheism, but at the same time, the acknowledgement, the fancy word being soteriology, that is, if Jesus saves, he has to be divine, because only God can save. Human beings can jump into the pit. They can obviously wallow in the quicksand. I don't know why it's quicksand, it should be slow sand, but they cannot liberate or free themselves. They cannot extricate themselves. So this is the issue they have to deal with. And very quickly, if you look at that paragraph, the top of page 5 on the outline. So the Council of Nicaea in 325, Constantine convenes that, and that's another issue we don't want to go down right now. There are two primary proponents or advocates. Athanasius, who will become the winner, and he's not a very nice guy, but his ideas become formative for the tradition. All right, he has to protect the divinity of Christ because only God can save, therefore Jesus has to be divine. And Arius is the other person, and Arius is trying to protect God because he knows that God cannot suffer, God can't die. And so in some sense, Jesus has to be demoted, can't be co-equal with God. There was a time in which he was not, that is, Jesus was created. Okay, and that becomes a debate. And the bottom line for us is that the tradition is going to argue, Athanasius, that Jesus and God share the same substance. Now, you and I don't talk this language. This is Greek, not just Greek, the language, but also in terms of Aristotelian understanding. So they share the same substance. And the technical term is homoousios. So Jesus and God share the same essence. They share the divinity such that there is unity. And that's the key understanding. We can go into detail, but I'll wait for your questions. And so you look at the language, God from God, light from light, true God from true God. That's pretty high Christology, Hank. That's pretty high Christology. Okay, so the assumption is then that Jesus is fully divine. Why is he fully divine? Because only God can save. And you cannot have two gods, got to have one. So there has to be this shared unity. The second question is just the opposite. How do you get this eternal God, right, who is the second person of the Trinity? How do you get this person to be human? This is the problem of high Christology. Okay, and this is resolved, or at least attempted to be resolved, at what we call the Council of Chalcedon in 451. Two schools of thought: the Alexandrian school, which is what we'll call the high Christology school, and the other school is Antiochian, and the Antiochian school starts with the assumption that Jesus is human. And so again, the issue is God in Christ means that Jesus has to be fully divine, but Jesus also has to share the same qualities that we do. And the phrase that's down here is, what is not assumed is not saved. That is, what is not incarnate in Jesus as human is not saved. This is where it can get really funky. The best example would be, think of a human being standing up. So from the neck up, Jesus is divine. So he always has the best ideas and the only ideas, and they're pure, right? Right? No sin. So from the neck down, Jesus is human. Well, that's not a complete person. That doesn't work. So the tradition is going to argue through several series of conversations. We'll call them conversations or dialogue. They're actually nasty controversies, right? Because life is at stake in these deliberations. So they try to talk about what part of Jesus is human, what part of Jesus is divine. And they eventually come to the conclusion that Jesus has to be both fully human and fully divine. And if you look down the very last paragraph, the key phrase is, Jesus has two natures in one person. That's it. You want to encapsulate, summarize the Christian understanding of Jesus, it's two natures in one person. Two natures, fully human, fully divine. Not partial human, not partial divine, fully, but in one person. And that's the unity. Okay? So the very last two lines, I think, are the most important. As fully human, Jesus is in full solidarity with us. That is, Jesus knows what it means to be a human being in the world, living in the human condition, living in a post-fallen world. He knows the temptations and anxieties. My gosh, the stories are replete with that. You know, he doesn't want to drink from this cup, right? So Jesus is fully human. Jesus is in full solidarity with us, but he's also the ideal human. And therefore, Paul will talk about Jesus as what? The second Adam. Through the first Adam, John Milton, right? Through the first Adam of disobedience, you have alienation and sin. You have a fallen world. Through the second Adam, Jesus, you have redemption and reconciliation. So Jesus takes on the fullness of what it means to be human, so that the entirety of being human is saved. What is not assumed is not saved. All human qualities or attributes are embedded, embodied in Jesus. But at the same time, he's fully divine. That is, God in Jesus is in full solidarity with us. So Jesus as human is in solidarity with us as humans. God in Christ is in solidarity with us, and therefore creates the possibility for redemption in the world. Okay, so that's the person of Christ in a nutshell. Fully human, fully divine. Only the God can save, but God saves human beings in their fullness, and Jesus is also in solidarity with both God and with humans. So there is unity between Jesus and God, but there is also distinction. And of course, self and other, that is the triune nature, is what that's getting at. All right. Let's move on to the work of Christ, if you will, the top of page 6. The work of Christ simply means, how does the tradition understand what Jesus accomplishes through cross and resurrection? And this obviously is crucial. I mean, it's foundational for the tradition. And again, Paul Jones doesn't have the answer. I have simply one way to talk about it. There are others that would offer alternative ways of doing it. My job tonight is to try to frame the conversation to help us understand why the tradition moves in this direction, why the tradition can't move into the left or the right position because it would endanger X or Y. It would reject monotheism and advocate for dualism, or it would talk about human beings not able to rectify the situation. So obviously the problem is that all have sinned, and the solution now is redemption. So crucifixion then is the cross, in other words, the passion, is the central motif of Christianity. All I need to know is Christ crucified, according to Paul, and obviously resurrected. And I have quotations there from Paul. You can read those on your own. So there are 3 questions that need to be addressed. What does it mean to profess or declare that Jesus saves? That's soteriology. That is, what does it mean to say that Jesus saves? Salvation, redemption, reconciliation, those terms. And what does Jesus do? That's the work that we're going to look at. And how is that expressed? And those are traditionally called atonement theories. So you notice that as you move through time, as the tradition matures and grows, it asks more and more questions. The initial question is obviously, who is Jesus? Why is he important to us? Who cares? So the focus of the early church is obviously to develop who is Jesus. And that's what we're seeing in 325 in Nicaea, and that's what we're seeing in 451 in Chalcedon. Only later in the tradition do you have full-blown what we call atonement theories. That is, ways in which we talk about, by analogy, they're not literal, by analogy, what is accomplished by the death and resurrection of Jesus. So those come after the fact. So there is kind of a, I think, kind of a logical sequence to this. So we're now talking about who is Christ, that's done first, and now we talk about the work of Christ. Now, obviously people were talking about it, but I'm talking about now in terms of the tradition formulating options which will engender sufficient consensus that they will be transmitted over time. And traditionally, there are 3 atonement theories. There are obviously more, and there are variations of these, but there are 3 classical atonement theories. That is, ways in which the tradition wants to use by analogy to try to make sense, right? That's what theology is doing, trying to make sense of what does it mean to say that Jesus saves, Jesus redeems. So the first one is called the Ransom Theory. You see this a lot on television. Christ the victor, or sometimes it'll be Christos victor. And that is, it has to do with a cosmic battle going on in the world. The hymn, the classic hymn, Mighty Fortress is Our God by Martin Luther, encapsulates that, if you want to look at that later. So what's the problem? Humans are prisoners of the devil, and they obviously need to be freed, need to be liberated. And there's a struggle then going on between good and evil forces in the world. And the solution is obviously they're going to be redeemed by Jesus, who is the ransom. He pays the price. Now, the fish analogy is coming early in the church, that in some sense, human beings have fallen, and the great fish can then swallow up human beings. And so what happens in this theory is that Jesus is like bait on a hook. Jesus looks like a human, acts like a human, and therefore, quote, the fish, the devil, assumes that Jesus is another human being like the rest of us, and therefore viable to consume, to swallow. And of course, the reality is Jesus looks like a human, but he also is divine. And so the fish then regurgitates human beings. It's a kind of a crass analogy, but it's one that's a classic one that's been around a long time. So the strength of that is that sin is taken seriously, and God is obviously victorious, Christus victor. The weakness is that it's very crass and It's really very dualistic and kind of simplistic in its way. And of course, part of it is that God is really playing a trick on the devil. That is, there are deceptions involved. That Jesus is fully human, but he's also fully divine, and therefore it's almost like you're not playing fair. The theological truth is that God does defeat the devil, and he does not use what you and I would call evil ways. That is, he plays fairly in the sense of it's not by force or coercion, but a lot of people don't like it because of this deception or this trickery that's built in. And so there's a need, if you will, for, what should we say, a more developed, perhaps more mature way of talking about how Jesus works, what's the atonement. And that moves then to Anselm writing in the 12th century. And he is essentially the author of what we now know as the satisfaction theory. It's probably the one that is referenced the most in terms of church. Or you hear the term substitutionary atonement theory. Think Mel Gibson and the movie The Passion of Christ, and you've got it. Okay, so you have to, in order to understand what Anselm is trying to do, you have to think in terms of the Middle Ages and the penance theory. So the analogy I would use is if you're driving your car and you get caught speeding, you're doing 60 in a 30 zone, you're going to be pulled over and you're going to be given a ticket and you're going to have to pay the price of the ticket, right? Otherwise you go to jail. Well, human beings don't have the capacity to pay the price. Because God is just and the world is moral, if you violate the rules of the world, you have to pay the consequences. But human beings are bankrupt. And now the question becomes, how do you have justice and mercy built into the universe? Justice means that God can't tweak or change or have a blind eye to the rules of engagement. And so Jesus then becomes then the reason why God becomes human, so that Jesus, fully divine, can pay the price, if you will. So the mercy of God in Jesus. So you have this understanding of penance. This is, again, a medieval theory about how it works. And what's unique about it is that the offense that humans, in terms of their disobedience, the problem is within God. That is, God is offended by what human beings have done. And that is very different than what the first one was. The first one is a problem that human beings have created for themselves. They're essentially tossed in jail, if you will, because of sin. That's different than what Anselm is talking about. So Anselm is talking about restoring God's honor. And it's done simply by humans cannot bring satisfaction to the legal system, and that it requires God's mercy and therefore requires God to become human, because only a human can pay the cost, because it's the humans that violated the law, right? It was a human driving the car that went 60. It's humans that are disobedient to God and dishonor God by sin. So only human beings can pay the price, but human beings don't have the capacity, don't have the treasury to be able to do that, and therefore God has to become human. And I think it's an ingenious way in terms of talking about the dilemma of what it means to be human and how God in Christ intervenes. So the strengths of that are very strong. The weakness of that is that a lot of people say that this seems rather sadistic, that God would require God's son to pay a price. And then why do you have to, in some sense, have the contingency of why you have to have death on a cross? Is there another way that God can, in some sense, engender grace or satisfaction without that? So more important, there are people throughout the tradition that have argued that this is, as Mel Gibson does, this is rather a bloody sacrifice. And so at the same time that Anselm was writing this, and Anselm's also the one that formulates the ontological argument for the existence of God, the moral influence theory by Abelard, a contemporary. The moral influence theory, again, I'm generalizing, overly generalizing, so I apologize to the formulators and the tradition as well as to you. The moral influence theory is, for me, this is the analogy. We're all old enough to remember the commercials when Michael Jordan was king of the universe. I want to be like Mike, right? Remember those? I think it was a cereal commercial, wasn't it? I want to be like Mike. And this is essentially what the moral influence or the exemplar theory of atonement is espousing. Human beings are ignorant. We have weak wills. We simply don't have the temerity to be able to get the job done. And so the solution is to awaken within us the love of God, to be like Mike. And so it's a non-supernatural explanation, which appeals to a lot of people today. The weakness, though, is pretty strong as well. I mean, essentially, Jesus is a teacher or a mentor or an example. And quite frankly, there's no need to even talk about crucifixion and resurrection, right? I can be a big brother or you can be a big sister. We don't talk about cross and resurrection. So it has some issues, but it also has some strength. That is the power of love to transform relationships. So let's look at the very bottom of page 7. And that is the fact that in today's world, and I've got 2 books sitting on my floor, which I'd like to read, that are contemporary. One that just came out a few weeks ago. I heard the author on the nice thing about Zoom. He was in Switzerland at the time, and it has to do with the crucifixion and the cross in relationship to Judaism. So the cross is a contested concept. Now, this is what I want to make clear, that the creed, Apostles' Creed, literally says that Jesus suffered under Pontius Pilate, was crucified, died, and was buried. You do not make that up. I don't know of any reputable scholar, historian, or theologian that is going to argue that the Christian tradition made up the crucifixion. That's a total embarrassment. You don't make that up. Your heroes aren't supposed to die. Okay? So now the question becomes, how do you deal with it? And many people in today's world are questioning the theological validity of it. That is, does it assume that in some sense God is complicit in violence? And so I raise that simply as a way of saying the crucifixion is an historical fact, I would say, for 99.9% of scholars. The question becomes, how do we understand that in terms of the salvific history or the sacred history of God? So if Jesus dies on the cross, he is simply another Jewish martyr. If that's the end of the story, he becomes one of many. And the best place to look for that is 2 Maccabees 7, the beginning of martyrdom that simply cannot be tolerated anymore. That is the Maccabean revolt, which 167, 165 BCE, where this is where Hanukkah comes from, where the Maccabeans, the Greeks, control Jerusalem, and the war is declared, the revolt, the rebellion, and the Jews are successful, and they purify the temple. But a lot of people are going to die because of that. And at this point in time in the 2nd century, you begin to see for the first time, this is what you need to realize, 2nd century BCE, 165 years before Jesus, you begin to see for the first time the concept of resurrection. It is a late concept in terms of Judaism. There are a few people that will argue that that resurrection is a part of the Torah, but I know of one book and one scholar that does that, and I'm not so sure that case is very convincing. Most people believe there's only one reference in the Jewish Bible, it's Daniel chapter 12, verse 2, to resurrection. So resurrection is a fairly new concept. Now, resurrection is the epicenter. That is, without resurrection, you simply have Jesus, a Jewish martyr, joining the legion and multitude of martyrs beforehand. Resurrection now becomes part and parcel of the Jewish thought world, but not everybody is going to endorse that. So on page 8, we'll look briefly at resurrection, then I want to make sure I leave some time for questions. Christians, by definition, are an Easter people. That is, resurrection is the epicenter of our life. And there are two forms the resurrection takes in terms of the biblical New Testament narratives. The first has to do with stories of the empty tomb. Notice I did not say stories of the resurrection. There are no stories of the resurrection, Jim, with the exception of one text, the Gospel of Peter. I mean, anybody read the Gospel of Peter? It's a non-canonical text that has an incredible story of Jesus coming out of the tomb and doing some other things. So we won't go into that, but there's only one text that actually describes, that narrates, that tells the story of resurrection. So the tradition talks about empty tomb. And the second thing it talks about is what we call resurrection appearances. That is, appearances to other people of the risen Lord. Okay? So the tradition in terms of bodily resurrection, that is, theologically, bodily resurrection becomes the way in which the tradition wants to talk, because that's going to be, if you will, the center lane. And they're going to avoid on one extreme what we call body-soul dualism. And this is what Gnosticism and Docetism are all about. And I've got those in the, hopefully everybody got my vocabulary list. Gnosticism and Docetism are early heresies of the church, because they're going to split the body and the soul. Body, material, flesh, evil, bad, don't want any part of it. Well, obviously, incarnation is kind of fleshy. So once you start moving that direction, you're violating a major tenet of Christianity. So you want to avoid that split, the dualism of body and soul. And at the other side of the road, you want to avoid the Platonic, the Neoplatonic understanding that the soul is immortal. Because if everybody has the immortality, has the capacity of having an immortal soul, you don't need Jesus, right? So the cultural context in which the early church is developing itself has two massive conversations going on. One is internal to the church, of which Gnosticism and Docetism are a part, and they're going to be declared heresies. And the other has to do with this Neoplatonic notion, going back obviously to Plato, of the soul is endemically immortal. Okay, so it has to negotiate those extremes and forge a middle ground. And the middle ground then will become resurrection with body. That is, bodily resurrection. Now the question becomes, what in the world do we mean by bodily resurrection? You and I default to, oh, well, I got flesh and blood, so I know what a body is. Throw a little resurrection in there and I know what I'm talking about. And that's not the case, obviously. So at the time of Jesus, there are varieties of understandings, and I've got that on that paragraph. Sadducees don't believe in resurrection. Pharisees, Essenes, and the fourth philosophy do. That is, these are the zealots, or Sakari, the ones that will rebel. And what we have to understand is that resurrection is an innovation in the Hebrew thought at the time of the 2nd century BCE. Now, when we look at the New Testament text, we see three things that are very important. Resurrection is not described. That is, they're empty tomb accounts. They're not resurrection accounts. The resurrection of Jesus is bodily. And the question becomes, what does that mean? And the third is that whatever we mean by resurrection, Jesus' body, there is no definitive consensus. That is, it's ambiguous. And I'll just give you quick examples. Obviously, Paul doesn't know Jesus, never met him, only the risen Lord on the road to Damascus. And so Paul talks about a spiritual body. See, he's trying to negotiate these two, right? It's a body, but it's not a body in the way that you and I know the body. And of course, the gospel writers are doing the same thing. I mean, they talk, I mean, Luke and Matthew have fairly carnal understandings of body, but Jesus is walking with two people on the road to Jericho, and what happens? They don't recognize him, right? And then he can walk through a door. So again, we don't want to identify resurrected body with physical body that you and I know. So that the tradition is remarkably sensitive about this. and it's going to have some fluidity in it. So we don't get hung up on that. In fact, that's good. I think variety and diversity is good. There is no simply one way to talk about what it means to say bodily resurrection. But we do know that, again, the beauty of the tradition is that there's a central lane and we're going to avoid the extremes. What's one extreme? That Jesus is a ghost or an apparition or an immortal soul. That doesn't work. Okay? And that's why in Matthew, the women grabs Jesus's feet. Ding, 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 ding. Ghosts don't have feet. So if you grab his feet, he ain't a ghost. Okay? That's the beauty of the tradition there at that point. So you're avoiding the concept that Jesus is a ghost or an apparition. On one extreme, that's a ditch. And the other extreme is you're avoiding that Jesus is simply a resuscitated corpse like Lazarus, because Lazarus is going to die again, right? So that doesn't work either. So again, the tradition, what I'm trying to get you to see is the beauty of the tradition is that it's negotiating a very complex, convoluted, and divergent conversation. And eventually it moves to the center, okay? So those are the extremes that has to be avoided. And the most important thing that body does for me is that it links, if you will, the historical Jesus, that is the Jesus of Nazareth who walked and talked and cured and healed, right, and prayed. That historical Jesus is linked directly and connected with the resurrected Jesus, what we call the Christ of faith, the post-Easter Jesus. The pre-Easter Jesus, meaning by that the historical Jesus of Nazareth, and the post-Easter Jesus, the resurrected Jesus. Because it's bodily, that's the continuity. So it's the same person. Jewish martyrs are expected to be raised, and they're to be raised in bodily form. We don't know exactly what that form looks like, but that's what the tradition wants to affirm. And Paul, of course, does that on the road to Damascus and in his understanding of spiritual body. So a lot more can be said. I commend you. I hope some of you are still awake because we've covered a massive amount of material. But again, the purpose is to frame the contours of the conversation, to understand why the tradition wants to move in this particular direction, why it wants to talk this way, and why it wants to avoid the extremes on both sides. Okay, I see I've got a question in the chat. Could you speak a little what it means? Okay, that's a high, and we've already done that. Kurt, you asked a question. Before the councils, the early Christians were referred to as the way. It's coming out of Acts. You are correct. In other words, one could say that we are saved by following the way of Jesus. That fits very well with moral influence. You are on top of it. Sidesteps the argument that Jesus is half divine because the Greco-Roman tradition, the only way to explain exceptional behavior is that God spawned Jesus by overpowering. I'm not sure, I agree with what you're saying, Kurt. I'm not sure I want to say that we are saved by following the way of Jesus. The reason I don't want to say that is because that's putting the burden, if you will, that's putting the responsibility, if you will, that's putting the work on humans. I am a very old-fashioned theologian. I may not, well, I can't say that anymore. I probably do look old in this sense, but I am, I think Luther's so-called principle, motto, justification by grace through faith, is critical. Meaning by that, human beings do not merit or warrant or earn salvation. Grace is literally an unsolicited free gift accomplished by God, hence God in Christ. There is human responsibility, there is a human choice, and that's to accept or reject. And to accept it, we say faith. To reject it, we don't. So, and Kurt, I think your way of explaining it is a nice way to talk about the value of the way, but I don't believe that sufficiently engages and captures the essence of the gospel as a free gift. That is, redemption, salvation, reconciliation is accomplished completely by God in Christ. The human response is not to in any sense contribute or participate. It simply is to acknowledge, recognize, accept, or reject. That's the way I would do it. I hope I'm being fair to your question, Kurt.
Yeah, it's just, I guess I see the councils and their work basically as a continuation of the birth narratives. And maybe that's too simplistic.
I'm not, I think you're onto something, and I would like to have a longer conversation on that. I like the way you're thinking about it. So I may be too simplistic in my response, but I am old-fashioned in the sense that grace is grace and faith is faith, and they're two different categories. One is a divine self-giving, the other is a human accepting. Any other questions or issues? I've covered so much. I may have lost you or exhausted you. Jim, let's see, if you ask more than 3 questions, you get a free gift. Is that it?
I go straight to heaven.
Oh, wow. I'm going to grab onto your feet.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, okay. I know most of the people, some of the people on this call. If you had people that didn't believe our history, our tradition, would you be embarrassed to say what you've done tonight
No.
for them?
No, I think, no, the answer is, I try to speak the same. My words may be different, analogy is different, but what I say to you as members of the church, or what I say to adults and what I say to students are, I've had Muslims in my class. So, you know, I try to tell it, quote, the way I see it. I think the first question that anyone who is serious about a religious tradition is, that is, if I want to understand Judaism, I ask a Jew. I want the best possible example of what it means to be a Jew, to explain to me what it means to be a Jew. I do not want to use contrived negative stereotypes, you know, and just, you know, knock over the straw person in that sense. So if I'm in conversation with other Christians, I will try to sharpen the edge so I see, you know, what we're talking about and why you can go X or Y, because again, the tradition is wide. It's more like a super highway than a single lane, right? If I'm talking to non-Christians, then I want to make sure that we have some understanding of our terminology. In the same way that we talk about God, you know, for God is a difficult concept, but sometimes you say, I don't believe in God, or I do believe in God. And the follow-up question is, well, tell me what you mean by God. So what I'm saying tonight is, you know, in one sense, I'm not even talking about my particular beliefs. I'm trying to understand why the tradition talks the way it does. Why is it configured the way it is? Why is it formulated this way? What's the larger conversation and context within which the tradition develops into the language and thoughts and ideas that we have today? In that sense, that's historical theology. It's systematic in the sense of I'm going through an order and a sequence, but it doesn't change. My style might change, but the substance doesn't change. Is that fair?
Yeah, thanks.
Sure. Anything else? I know we've got people have to depart. We're overtime. We're in extra innings. No extra charge. Anybody else have a question? Okay. Well, congratulations for making it through the night, or at least till this hour of the night. I'll do the same thing. I'll send out an outline. We'll do Holy Spirit and Church. Not quite as intense, but it has its own vitality, and we'll talk about that next Tuesday. Okay, so thank you again for your attention, your participation, and if you have issues or concerns, feel free to email. Otherwise, we'll see you next Tuesday night.
Thank you,
All right.
Paul.
Sure.
Thank you, Paul.